Hi, everyone. On today's podcast, we're going to talk with Cristen Pascucci, the founder of Birth Monopoly, about how to disagree respectfully when talking about childbirth topics. Hi, everyone. Today, I'm super excited to welcome my good friend and colleague, Cristen Pascucci, to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. After the birth of her son in 2011, Cristen left a career in public affairs to study American maternity care and women's rights within it. From 2012 to 2016, she worked with Improving Birth as their vice president, spearheading a multi-year grassroots media strategy to get the maternity care crisis into the national news. She also created a legal advocacy hotline for pregnant women, and she began raising awareness around obstetric violence through consumer campaigns, including the 2014 campaign of #BreakTheSilence. Cristen has helped organize, strategize, and publicize major lawsuits related to obstetric violence. She's co-creator of Exposing the Silence Project and host of Birth Aloud Radio, which is a podcast. At birthmonopoly.com, Cristen advocates for a freer maternity care market, working closely with leading national advocates, organizations, and birth lawyers, as well as educating the public and healthcare providers about the human and legal rights of people in childbirth. After 6 years of full-time work on the issue of obstetric violence, Cristen is in the middle of working on a documentary film called Mother May I. So Cristen and I just live a few miles apart from each other, and we talk nearly every day about a variety of issues related to maternity care. And I've always thought it would be interesting if people could just be a fly on the wall and listen to our conversations. So we thought we'd go ahead and record one of those conversations for you. We're bringing Cristen on particularly to talk about how to disagree respectfully, because hopefully soon we'll be releasing an article on the evidence and ethics on circumcision. And when we even talked about how we're going to be publishing an article on that, we hadn't even said what the article was going to say. We were flooded with a lot of really upset people who are upset that we were even going to talk about the issue. They're upset for a variety of reasons, which I understand, but it kind of worried us. Is our audience prepared to have discussions about these really controversial topics? So Cristen has a lot of experience helping people communicate more effectively, and we're excited to hear your thoughts. So tell us, Cristen, what kinds of controversies are there in the birth world that you've seen people argue about?
Oh, wow. So there are just so many. It's such a charged topic full of charged topics. So I think there are controversies within the birth community. And then there are controversies sort of like between the birth community and like the rest of the world. I mean, not that you don't change the rules on the communication, but within the community, advocacy is one thing that you and I have talked about a whole bunch. Something I've been thinking about a whole lot lately has been like the nice white lady syndrome, which is sort of like the idea of like your default should always be to not make waves and not be too confrontational. Let's see, within the community, gosh, I mean, I see doulas having all kinds of discussions. I mean, you know, for example, if you don't support circumcision, can you as a doula support a family who chooses circumcision? If you have an opinion on, actually, that's too controversial. I won't bring that up.
So there's things that are so controversial that you don't even bring them up.
Yeah, I just did it. Yeah, I just said like, I wouldn't even bring that up here. Yeah.
I want to know what it is. I mean, you're not saying what your opinion is, but what's the controversy that is so bad that you can't talk about it?
I actually can think of more than one thing. Like I just started like self-censoring, like while we started talking about this, which I think is really interesting that I just did that. Maybe we should talk about that.
Okay. So why did you stop yourself? You just said that there were some things that are so controversial that, and then you said, for example, and then you just stopped and you said, I can't say it. So what was going on in your head when you stopped and you wouldn't talk?
Well, so I think that because some things are so charged that even bringing them up and like, this actually has so much to do with communication. You mention like the word or the topic and people immediately flip into I would actually use the word triggered, like they flip into a trigger about it. And so my thinking just now was, you know what, before I trigger people bringing up specific topics, we should talk a little bit about the communication and ease them into the idea. So maybe they're less likely to be triggered when we bring up certain things, which has a lot to do, like, I think that's something we need to talk about. Like, that's part of my whole communication strategy is really being very conscious around triggers. But yeah, like, I mean, I feel like there really are some like kind of like deep issues. I mean, the funny thing is like, I guess like I think of them as sort of niche things, but they're really not niche things. Racism, sexism, misogyny, very personal medical decisions like circumcision and vaccines and vitamin K.
So talk a little bit about your strategy then, and then maybe we can get into how you approach some of these difficult topics. So what's your strategy when you're talking about something that you feel might be triggering to people? Because I know for people who follow Cristen, she talks about a lot of really hard stuff, like, obstetric violence, which can be really incredibly hard for people to listen to stories of obstetric violence, such as forced episiotomies. One thing I know you've been working on is when doctors manually tear a woman's perineum instead of doing an episiotomy. Some just really graphic, horrifying things. So how do you talk about that kind of stuff?
I think trauma awareness is super, super important. I think I've always known before I even knew about trauma and triggers that you can't bring emotions into these kinds of discussions, because what ends up happening is you just have two sides that are just like emoting all over each other, and there's not a discussion happening. So back before I ever got into birth, my job was being involved in like very controversial, very public projects that had political implications and that, usually were like major PR problems. And so I learned back then that the worst thing you could do was have an emotional response. And you always wanted to bring it back to the facts, like over and over and over and over, even if someone was, being super emotional in what they were saying, that you literally just ignored, like absolutely ignored the emotion and just responded to the factual, even if it was insults, name calling, whatever. You literally just ignored that and just respond to the facts. So, in theory, that leads the discussion in a certain way, that hopefully that person can then start communicating on facts. And I think more important, or not necessarily more important, but sometimes more importantly, these conversations are happening in public for the most part. These are things that are happening on social media. They're happening at conferences, stuff like that. So it's more about the audience watching the discussion that's happening and less about actually convincing the person that you're talking to. Does that make sense?
So when you're disagreeing with someone, your goal is not to make them see your side or come to agreement with you, but it's more being mindful of what other people are reading or listening to.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So I always just keep in mind that I'm not trying to convince this person. I don't have the power to convince this person. It's not my responsibility to convince this person. What I can do is inform. And, just like a doula, right? I can provide information. And I think the value is really usually for other people who are watching the discussion happening, and they are absorbing, what's going on both sides. So they might see one person emoting all over the place and calling names, and they see the other person just offering facts. And so I think you're much more likely to have a positive impact with your view if you are approaching it in a factual way. I mean, watching people yell and scream at each other like isn't usually a very good way of, getting your point across to an audience.
Why do you think so many people, it almost seems like they'll gang up on someone and try and convince them of their way using name calling and, just really disrespectful language. Why do you think people use that strategy? I mean, is it ever successful, or does it just result in silencing people?
No, I mean, I think the research is pretty clear. Like that doesn't work. I think people get triggered and they respond And actually, let me just back up a second and say what you're describing is something that happens generally on social media. So that's not something that happens in like a person-to-person discussion.
Right.
That is sort of like a social media phenomenon, which is a real shame, because I can almost guarantee you the person who made that original comment and is getting totally ganged up on, they're probably turning off their notifications and not coming back. Don't respond well to like being bullied into thinking something, that just doesn't work. And I think, again, research shows that more often than not, people actually dig in harder when they're being attacked like that. They feel defensive instead. If people are coming at you in an attacking way, well, the last thing you're going to do is then be vulnerable and actually engage in some sort of substantive communication with them. No, you're going to clamp down and you're going to dig in your heels more, and you're going to act defensively and reactively. And I think we see that happen all the time. And I see it, and I've done it too. I'll see some comment that totally triggers me, and I'll feel like, oh, I have to say something, even if like 30 other people have already said something. It's really more about me expressing a trigger than it is about communicating with that commenter. And I think that's like a hallmark of social media.
Yes, let's talk a little bit more about social media. So we kind of you can respectfully disagree on social media or disrespectfully disagree, or in person. So let's talk about social media first. What are some strategies that you use to engage respectfully with people when you don't agree with their opinions or what they're posting?
So first of all, never comment when you're triggered. I think that's the number one thing. And so something that I have on my comments policy for Birth Monopoly: if you feel your heart racing, your head a little fizzy, very emotional, or overwhelmed by memories, you may be experiencing a trigger. It is usually a good idea to sit in that trigger and feel what you are feeling rather than reacting out to others in that moment. Triggers can be very powerful opportunities for us to address where we need healing, and they can also be damaging when we speak out of them in our heart. So I think that's probably my number one thing. And listen, I break that rule. I'm not like, I do sometimes break that rule, and I almost always regret it. But usually I break it in a place where I'm sort of like, the consequences there aren't going to be very many consequences if I break this rule right here. But I absolutely in high stakes discussions, I want to say never respond out of a trigger.
So you'll usually pause and walk away.
Yeah. And I mean, pause, not like for 30 seconds or 5 minutes, but like it often will take like an hour or a couple of hours, or, depending on what it is, it might be the next day or a couple days. In fact, Rebecca, I can think of something you and I talked about recently that I said to you. You said, so are you going to respond? And I was like, actually, I need like a week. Like that one is super, super deep for me. And I'm going to need like a lot of time to think about that one if I end up responding at all to that comment.
Sometimes the right choice is to not respond.
Well, yeah. And that's a super, super valid response, is don't respond. So I think that let me finish talking about triggers, and then we'll talk about that. So along with your own triggers is identifying when the other person is in a trigger. What I have on my comments policy is, it is helpful to identify when someone else is acting out of a trigger and respond by giving them space to process rather than pushing back on their trigger. For example, if someone says, you should just be happy your baby is healthy and not complain. I had an episiotomy without consent and I didn't like it, but my baby is just fine. It is usually more useful to simply validate their experience than to argue their comment. For example, I might say something like, I'm glad to hear your baby is healthy, and I'm sorry to hear something was done to your body without your permission. In fact, I don't even know, depending on the context, I don't even know if I would put that second part, sorry to hear something was done to your body without your permission. I think that, to me, I hear trauma in that statement. When someone says, well, I had that done to me and I was just fine and you should something, like there's emotion in there. Like they feel strongly about this thing that happened to them, and they might have trouble assigning that emotion. Like they're not willing to acknowledge that, when they say, I didn't like it, it's like, they're kind of admitting something there, but then even though there's like cognitive dissonance happening or dissonance happening there where they're saying, I didn't like it, but it was just fine,
And you should be okay with it too.
Yeah. And you should be okay with, being violated as well. Pushing back on that trigger doesn't do anything except exacerbate their trigger. Like you're not going to have a productive conversation by pushing back on someone's trigger. So yeah, so to me, it's all about that, just that idea of like, it's not my responsibility. I can't convince anyone else. I can't make them think anything. And in this case, the responsible thing to do and the best thing to do is to respond with compassion and give them space for what they have expressed. And, if you know how trauma and triggers work, that person is looking for basically attention. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but they're needing attention around that trigger. And so they're lashing out at you in, subconsciously to get attention on that trigger. And so when I read that, I think I'm going to give them attention around that trigger, but I'm going to give them healthy attention rather than unhealthy attention. So I'm not going to argue with their trigger. I'm going to give them space for their trigger. So maybe they'll have, just a few seconds there of being able to process that trigger a little bit more and like in a healthy way instead of just using it as like a weapon. So yeah, so generally when I hear somebody or see, pick up that there's trauma in a comment, I really try to respond by making space for it. And this works too. Like I've seen it happen. Like I've, experienced this myself many times where when you give the person the space instead of attacking them or going back at them, they can actually like work it out. Like you can actually have a discussion at that point. So like an example might be if I said to that person who said, you should feel fine about it too. If I said, I'm really glad to hear your baby is healthy. And say I said, and sorry to hear something was done to your body without your permission. It's possible that that person might get to a point of, yes, thanks. I was really relieved that he was okay. It felt really scary when they were saying, when they cut me because, it seemed like it was an emergency. And then you can start like kind of unraveling it a little bit with them. And I think, this isn't something that people should just go doing willy-nilly, but because it does take a little bit of skill, but the bottom line is you're just holding space for them and you're not telling them what they should think or what they should feel. And expressing compassion and just validating their experience is such an effective healing tool that, sometimes you can actually like help somebody heal a little bit instead of getting in a fight with them. And I really have like actually seen this work like time after time after time. And sometimes I'm like blown away by seeing it in action when you give someone the opportunity to heal rather than, emoting back on them out of your trigger, that you can contribute to a little bit of health for them.
Yeah, I've seen that before in our email inbox, actually, at Evidence-Based Birth. Sometimes people will reach out to us upset about something or other. And when we validate their experience and say, that's right, you're right, that was wrong, or that shouldn't have happened, or maybe it was a customer service thing and we made a mistake, here's how we're going to fix it for you. They almost always respond back graciously. It's like, even if their first email was very angry and disrespectful and kind of an inappropriate level of anger for email, for some reason that feeling validated is very helpful for people because they realize that you're actually listening to them.
Yeah. And a lot of times, like, they were approaching it defensively because they're expecting you to fight with them.
Yeah.
And when you don't, it's like a big relief for them. And what you just said, about listening and then like actually admitting when you're wrong, I think is really important. I lost my sensitivity around being wrong like a long time ago. It's actually in kind of a funny way. I realized that in my job in public affairs that, I was doing stuff all the time that I had absolutely no experience doing. It was just the nature of the job. There were just things that you would do one time in a lifetime and you had to do it for the client. And, there was no way that you were going to become an expert in the thing that one time for that one client. So I got really used to just feeling stupid. And I thought at some point, I just thought, I mean, who cares if I'm stupid or, if I feel stupid, I'm just going to get this done for the client. And so losing that like sensitivity around feeling stupid was really helpful, because then I could call up a service provider or a vendor, whomever, and say, hey, I just don't get this. Can you just explain it to me? Like, just totally explain this to me. Like, you're starting from scratch, somebody who doesn't know anything about anything. And it was really helpful. Now, if I had pride about it and I didn't want to admit to them that I didn't really understand like all the, nuts and bolts of what we were doing, then I really couldn't participate as well, because I wouldn't know what I was talking about. So I would have to like not engage as much. So, just really getting comfortable with not knowing everything was really, really helpful. And in communication, I think that's such a great thing. Like, I love saying, I don't know. I love saying, I don't know. It's like such a freeing thing, because I think for a long time, I had much more of like a know-it-all attitude. And so now it's just like awesome to say, I don't know. And it's honest, and it's, it's not misleading the person with information that you're not really sure about just to make a point. And it gives them an opportunity to like go find out from a good source, rather than, sending them in the wrong direction or whatever, or misinforming them. So anyway, I really love saying, I don't know. I'm sure no one likes saying that I was wrong, but it's such a great way to build trust. It takes vulnerability to say I was wrong. And so when you allow yourself to be vulnerable in that way, a lot of times people will extend that vulnerability back to you, because they recognize that it takes vulnerability to admit that you were wrong. And, again, this is just something I've seen in practice like so many times, is showing vulnerability yourself brings it out in other people. And you have to have strength to do that. And, I'm sure there's like all this Brene Brown stuff out there about vulnerability. And I think it's such a fundamental that like, it really does take strength to be vulnerable. And once you do it, you build resilience around it. And that's a really great feeling, I think. Another option that we talked about, we mentioned a little bit before, was not responding at all. And to me, that's a little bit of vulnerability, right? Because you always want to like get the last word, or, make your point. You don't want to make it look like you were, you backed down from a fight or something like that. But walking away, choosing to spend your time elsewhere is kind of a healthy adult decision sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes it can be used in a passive aggressive way, but also I think sometimes it can also be a healthy boundary to say, I can't communicate with this person about this topic anymore.
Yeah, no. And you make a good point about passive aggressive communication. And I think that's probably something we should talk about.
Before we do that, you talk a lot about the word trigger. And I have to say, someone who used to be in academia, there's a lot of, for a while, that was a hot term, and like professors were afraid of saying anything that might trigger their students. And then there was kind of a backlash against that, saying like, we all have all these vulnerable students who can't have a conversation about anything hard, and we're so worried about their triggers. And like, it's almost like the pendulum has swung back to like, well, we should be able to say anything we want in front of students. So why is it that you feel really strongly about identifying triggers? And can you explain a little bit more about kind of trauma in the birth world and triggers and stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I have strong feelings about this. I'm a communication person. So I want to make sure, or I shouldn't say make sure because I can't control it, but I want to do the best I can to get my message across. So if I have this information, I know someone's in a trigger, I know they're not hearing me. So I'm looking at it from like an efficacy standpoint. So I'm not looking at it from political correctness or academia or any of that. I'm just like, what do I know about communication? What do I know about trauma? What do I know about actually getting through to people and making sure things sink in? Ultimately, a lot of what we do is about changing hearts and minds. So to me, that's my number one consideration is like, how good is this communication? So, if I were an academic standing in front of a class and I have a mandate to get through a certain agenda, then like, that's what's important to me. And like, sure, of course I care that my students are getting it, but my boss or my institution is holding me to, you need to get through these items. So like, that's going to be what's more important in that scenario. And, the piece about making sure it lands properly for each and every single person might just be lower on the priority list. For me, we're talking about social justice issues, some very deep human condition type stuff. And so for me, communication is the most important thing. And communication means, getting your message through and making sure, doing what you can so that it lands in the most effective way. So for me, I have to study trauma. I have to know about triggers in order to
why
make
is that?
happen. Otherwise, I'm just spewing a message all over the place without measuring the impact that it's having.
Why is it that you have to have a focus on trauma? Can you explain for people who might not understand the link between trauma in the birth world?
Yeah, I mean, the birth world is chock full of trauma. It creates trauma. It exacerbates trauma. It fails to support trauma. I mean, it is just like a cesspool of trauma. So you've got birth trauma from firsthand experiences. Okay. So as a consumer, you may have, there's like a decent chance actually that you have experienced some sort of birth trauma. So, say like a 1 in 3 chance that you've experienced birth trauma. I would guess that number is even higher among birth workers, because just from my own personal experience working with thousands of birth workers, many, many people get into birth work because they had a negative birth experience. So they're already, they're literally coming into the job with birth trauma. Then they go into the job and they're experiencing secondary trauma in the course of their job. We know that nurses and doctors have high rates of things like PTSD, burnout, suicide. These are known phenomena. Like we know that this is a thing. There's all kinds of trauma. Layered on that is just the context in which it's happening. So you've got a female dominated field. As a woman, you've got the trauma that comes from being that oppressed class already. So you're dealing with a world that is sexist and misogynist. And as a Black woman or a Black person, as a person of color, as a Native American person, any other, right? You've got layers of oppression. And oppression and trauma go hand in hand. So you're already coming in with your own trauma. And of course, there are all kinds of it's like a limitless number of groups, right? It's plus size people, it's teenagers, it's queer people, it's trans people, it's, we could go on and on and on. It's differently abled people. And I've left out a whole bunch of people even in that little list. So people are already coming in with their life experiences of trauma. And then you're entering, let's say, a labor and delivery room, you're entering like this concentration of trauma. So you're in a high pressure situation where these decisions have to be made, but there are all these power dynamics going on. And we know that there's just trauma happening in in maternity care right there. So you've got like new trauma and old trauma, and it's all like
people lash out at one another in horizontal violence too. So
that was the next thing I was going to say. Yeah. And then you have like the intergroup trauma. So then you've got, let's say nurses. So, because this is such a well-documented phenomenon. So you've got nurses who are experiencing and perpetrating high levels of horizontal violence. So that's against each other and from each other. So as a group of people it's mostly women, and they are acting within a highly formalized structure of hierarchy where it's very clear where they are and it's not at the top. So they're experiencing a level of oppression just from their profession itself, that they are, they're below all these other, on the chain of command, they're down, they're down, closer to the bottom than the top. And so their trauma is shooting out at each other. And I think that, so you've got like, a couple of different layers there. You've got the trauma that they're bringing in as a profession that is dominated by women. So you've got, it's staffed by an oppressed group of people. Then you're in a situation that lends itself to more violence because you've got this level of a profession that is really nailed into a lower spot on the hierarchy in maternity care and in hospitals. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it almost reminds me of Kimberly Crenshaw-Shaw's discussion of intersectionality and how the experience of a white woman can differ drastically from a Black woman. They're both experiencing sexism, but they're experiencing other layers of racism, for example, for the Black woman. So you're saying nurses have like these intersecting circles of different things that they're experiencing that kind of all come together in labor and delivery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you see really high levels of bullying and, workplace aggression among nurses. And it's very well documented. It's, I think you and I actually went to a talk
by Dr. Cheryl Beck about the rate of PTSD among labor and delivery nurses was very high. But there was another speaker there at that day at that event we went to, talked about the high levels of workplace aggression. And there's been tons of research on that in both nurses and midwives.
Yeah. And so I think we also recognize that in the doula world. And, I just see it with my own eyes all the time. That perception of like competition instead of collaboration and the bad doula versus the good doula. And, that's not me. And, a really biggie is aligning with the oppressor. So that's a major characteristic of horizontal violence is that some people in the group are going to survive that dynamic by aligning themselves with the people in power who are in a different group, in a more powerful group. And, to do that, they often have to alienate themselves from people within their own group. So they would be sort of maligning the people in their own group as part of their strategy to align with the more powerful, oppressive group.
Okay. So, Cristen, we've talked a lot about, being aware of people's triggers and not, pressing into that too hard. But if we did that all the time, we'd never speak our truth. So talk a little bit about how you balance respecting all of this trauma that we know exists in the birth world and how we can talk about subjects that are controversial.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's really important, right? Like, the other half of the term respectful confrontation is confrontation. So respect is really important, but so is the actual, the confrontation. And the way you and I know, define confrontation is face-to-face meeting. It's like,
and this comes from a book that Cristen and I have both read many times, which is called Mastering Respectful Confrontation by Jo Weston. And she introduced that book to me, and we use it all the time when we're teaching. In terms of, we recommend that book to everybody. So confrontation has a bad connotation for most people.
Yeah. And one of the things that Jo Weston points out is that confrontation and conflict are not the same thing. So conflict has more to do with like winning and defeating and decimating your opponent, whereas confrontation really just in its, purest form is a face-to-face meeting. So to balance out all this talk that we have had just in this episode about the need for respect and all of those things, we're not saying that you shouldn't speak your truth. And I think that's really important. I consider myself to be an activist. So I say things all the time that are going to be triggering to people. And I look at it from a responsibility point of view. So like, I have this need to communicate. I also have a responsibility to speak the truth. And so at some point I have to just let it go that this stuff is going to be triggering to some people. And it's not my responsibility to manage their triggers. It's their responsibility to work on their triggers or to identify their triggers. So you've got what you might consider sort of like competing objectives there, which is the communication the communication aspect where I want to make sure stuff lands for people. But then there's this activism portion, right? And there's this truth telling portion that is really, really important. And I feel really committed to the truth. It's really important to me. And I just feel like communicating it respectfully is generally the better way to go. But if it comes down to like respect versus truth, I will probably tell the truth, even if it doesn't feel respectful for some people.
Some people don't like the message. And we can't always.
Yeah, you can't change your message because some people aren't going to like it. Like you'll never get anything done. I mean, a lot of people like hate a lot of things that I say, like really. And probably, you know, some of the things that you say, Rebecca, I mean, that's just reality. And you have to be willing to live with that reality that's, if you're suggesting something that is outside the status quo or goes against norms, like, yeah, there's going to be resistance. I mean, that's what it is. That's what this gig is. We're not out there to tell people what they already know and they're like ready to agree with.
Yeah, that's true. We're not here to just pat everyone on the shoulders and say, good job. No need to do any better. You're all doing perfect.
Yeah. So this is something that comes up for me, sometimes talking with physicians or nurses or hospital administrators, where I have things to say that like they don't like. And I'm fine with that. Like they don't have to like it. And I'm going to be respectful. You know, I'm not out there like calling people names or, you know, whatever. But I'm also not going to subjugate myself. And I'm not going to not speak the truth just because someone doesn't like what I have to say, because, you know, examples I just mentioned, a lot of what I talk about and what you talk about conflicts with the status quo. Like, again, that's the nature of what we do. So I won't flinch from expressing the truth, and I will do it respectfully. But I think both of those things are equally important.
Yeah, I agree. So what advice do you have for us as we're coming upon the release of the circumcision article? I have to say the level of angst that came out when we even said we were doing something like that, it took my team by surprise. I was not surprised because I've told people for years when they asked me to publish an article on this topic, I said, I'm never touching circumcision with a 10-foot pole. Like, it was just like, I didn't even want to go there.
There's good reason for that. Like, it is something that people are so emotionally charged about. It's a giant trigger for people. So it might, you know, when you say I'm not touching it with a 10-foot pole, that's because you're making yourself a lightning rod for people's anger and grief and self-righteousness and, you know, all kinds of things. So yeah, I get why you wouldn't want to touch it. Even if you had extremely strong feelings one way or the other, I can absolutely see why you wouldn't touch it. I have a couple of issues at Birth Monopoly that that I feel like that about.
That you don't like to talk about?
Yeah. That I think that at this time, it wouldn't be a good way to spend resources.
And I think I remember specifically one conversation I had about the circumcision topic was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And that's when I said, I'm never touching it. At that time, I didn't feel like I could handle, I don't know. I almost was like the hate. Yeah. Like just the anger.
Listen, there's trolling. Let's be honest. Like there is a pocket of people in that issue who absolutely troll, which sucks because
then we can't have conversations.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel that way about it. That's one of those topics that like, I kind of, because the trolls come out, even though I want to say, hey, I agree with you. Just stop trolling, like I'm actually in agreement with your position on this, but boy, are you blowing this up as far as communication. For me, it's like embarrassing, and there are, many issues that I'm sure I feel like that about. And I'm sure other people feel like that about, where you're like, oh man, it sucks when sort of the crazies come out about it, because then it's like, ugh, you've kind of blown it for all of us. I don't want to be associated with that. And for good reason, not just because, I don't have a backbone.
I just didn't, for many years, I didn't have the bandwidth, just the emotional or mental bandwidth to have to deal with the backlash, because for many years I was doing evidence-based birth alongside a full-time academic job. And now I feel like I've been through the fire a couple times with vitamin K, got a lot of hate mail. Groupie strep, got a lot of hate mail. And I guess my skin has gotten a little bit thicker. So I was thinking, well, maybe I can do this now. Part of me feels like there's a need to be able to lay the information out there about the ethics, about the research in a non-judgmental way that hopefully I know parents are looking for, because they email and message us all the time asking for it, because they can't seem to find that information anywhere else. Everybody else seems to have this agenda, either into shaming them for making one choice or to making them feel stupid for not doing it. So it just seems like I felt like we were in a good spot where we could kind of be that voice of reason.
You can take the heat right now.
I think I can, although I worry that I can't, because, I think I don't know the level to which we're going to experience
the vitriol.
Yes. And it's hard because we want to be part of the conversation and host it in a respectful way. So I guess that's kind of my plea to our listeners is when the circumcision article comes out, remember that we're all here to talk with each other respectfully about these issues. And that's just my plea.
Yeah. And I would say to people listening, respect the forum. You don't have to be everything to everyone. If your philosophy and the culture of evidence-based birth is about respectful dialogue, then you have every right to create that and enforce it in your forums and on your social media. I've gone back and forth about, that whole idea of censorship and safe spaces and, all this stuff for a really long time. And having my own social media platforms, I have finally come to this decision that, I worked really hard to grow those places. And the people who are there because they appreciate the culture that I have created. And I would say the same for evidence-based birth. People don't come to evidence-based birth so they can get nasty and get in the mud and have those insults. Just have those really just low, dirty, fights that you might see in the comment section at the New York Post or something. There's a reason that people, want to have a discussion in that kind of space. And I think it's really valuable for the community that evidence-based birth would create that space. And I would just hope that people can recognize that for what it is and see the value in that. And, think about it. If it's really important to you to be able to call people names and, be angry and attack people, what are you doing? Do you think that is helpful? Do you think that actually convinces people? Because, from what I saw, I'm just going to say this. From what I saw, the anti-circumcision movement for a long time was I refused to listen to anything they had to say because of how offensive they were. It took me on my own learning some stuff before I came around to a different position. I think, people should really take that seriously, that, what is your purpose here? Is your purpose to just spew your trauma all over everyone? Or do you really care about the issue? And do you really care about changing hearts and minds on it? Go see a therapist, go talk to a trusted friend if what you need to do is spew your trauma everywhere.
Yeah, I appreciate that. When I was working in nursing research, I used to say that people would emotionally vomit all over me, which is kind of when you're saying spewing trauma, I'd be they emotionally vomited on, because sometimes, you're in the right spot at the right time and somebody needs to just get it out of their system. And I remember specifically one time as a staff nurse when a patient was receiving substandard care from their physician and I was not in a position to fix it. They were stuck at the hospital. They couldn't go home because their physician screwed up. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. And the family of the patient literally started yelling at me. And me, I'm just this, as a nurse, I've always pride myself on being so kind and compassionate. I'm standing there and they're just screaming in my face. And I kept saying, there was nothing I could do to fix it. It was wrong. What had happened to them was wrong. And I became the target of their anger. And it was one of the hardest moments of my life to have such hate directed at me personally. But I had to keep telling myself, they're not angry with me. Like they're turning their anger on me, but they're not angry at me. And that really helped kind of protect
Yeah.
myself in the situation. But it was still really hard. And I was just a fresh nurse. I think I'd been working for like a year. And I remember going out to the nurse's station and just crying and crying because even though I knew that it wasn't my fault and their anger wasn't at me, it was at somebody else, they just pointed it at me. It was a horrible experience. No, it's not really effective for that. I don't think for that family to do that either.
No, I mean, what happened was they abused you because they felt they had a lot of feelings, right?
Right.
And so it's really helpful for the person on the receiving end to be able to identify what's happening so that you not take it personally. And so you can actually have compassion for where they're coming from.
Yeah.
To identify the reason they're so, they're screaming in my face right now is because this is like the depth of their grief and anger and, maybe guilt or regret, about how, whatever, how I didn't protect my mother better in this medical setting, or I should have said something, or, all these different things. And I do want to actually comment because what I said before, I think sounded pretty harsh when I said, go, don't spew your trauma. Unfortunately, like people are spewing their trauma all the time. And there's just like such a lack of awareness, like they don't even realize what they're doing. And so kind of a dead end to say, stop spewing your trauma. But I think, for people who are aware of what's happening, you can at the very least not participate in that. And I think at the most, you can actually help people heal a little bit. And, sort of that neutral middle is identifying what's happening to yourself and creating some space for some compassion within you. It neutralizes the response. It is interesting though, because what you brought up is something that I've had some talks with Nicole Shapiro about, and she's somebody who I see as an expert on a lot of this stuff, is about where's the line between compassion and, holding space for someone and being abused by them, And so that's a really tricky thing, but I think we all have to, identify that for ourselves. And, nobody should have to put up with abuse just because they want to be compassionate.
And I did want to say the story had a happy ending because they did end up having to stay, I believe, an additional night because of the mistake that the physician made. But shortly after that happened, Dan, my husband, Mr. EBB, he walked in with a slice of cheesecake and like walked up to the nurse's station. It was a total surprise. I didn't know he was coming. And I saw him and I like burst into tears. And I tried to never cry at work. And it was a very emotional day, but it just was a reminder to me that when you are the target of anger or disrespectful confrontation, that, you've got to create those safe spaces for you to recover from what you experienced. Have that kind of, as Carrie Tushoff of Hypnobabies would say, a bubble of peace that you can retreat to, to get away from it all.
Absolutely. And like here, this is the full circle on the trauma right here is, the term that we use right now, which I hate even saying the word self-care. There has got to be a better term. But, part of stopping that, having the buck stop here with the trauma is the self-care or whatever we want to call it in yourself when something like that is directed at you. And maybe this is sort of a good closing note. But because you can't heal other people, sometimes all you can do is heal yourself. But the thing is, when you heal yourself, you end up healing other people. So what I mean by that is, if you can't control other people's triggers and their trauma and their anger and, all of these other things, what you can do is learn yourself and build your own resilience and build your own skill set so that you are as healthy as you can be. And just in like existing as a healthy person or, the healthiest you can be, which of course it's always a journey, you're participating in healing the community. So that has always been sort of a touch, not always, but, in recent years, since I've learned more about it, that has been like a touchstone for me is when something is out of my hands, it's out of my control, there's nothing I can do about it. And I feel the need to take action. The action I can take is to go inwards rather than outwards and trying to, impact other people directly. But the more I and we heal ourselves, build up our own resilience and recover from trauma and develop skills around trauma and communication, we're sort of healing the community ourselves. And that benefits everyone, including those people who we can't reach directly.
Right. It creates a sustainable career too, to be able to heal yourself and have longevity, because we all know that we need to be doing this work for a long time, because it's not going to be a quick and easy journey. Well, thank you, Cristen, so much for joining us on the podcast. How can our audience follow you?
Oh, thanks for asking. Birth Monopoly is on Facebook and Instagram. And if you join my email list, which you can do at the top of my website, birthmonopoly.com, there's a free guide to informed consent and refusal during hospital birth. So that's a really great download, and it's free. So you can go get that. It comes with a little mini informed consent and refusal email course with it. So
that's cool. And I'd encourage you all also to visit mothermayIthemovie.com and watch the trailer for the documentary that Cristen Pascucci is making with Caroline Malatesta, traveling all around the country. And I think it's a really important project. So thank you again, Cristen, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was a fabulous conversation with Cristen Pascucci. I feel so lucky that I get to talk to her all the time. And just so you all know, the circumcision article is coming out next week. So you can expect next Wednesday for the blog article to go live. Also, I will record a podcast explaining the results from the article for all of you. The article will be free to the public, available at Evidence-Based Birth. We will also have a printer-friendly PDF in the library for our members and for our childbirth class students. And we are also working on creating a one-page handout on the topic as well. Make sure you're subscribed to our email list at evidencebasedbirth.com so that we can send you that notification when the article is released and when the one-page handout is ready. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next week. Bye.